Good evening and welcome to The Access. Tonight we'll be discussing Chinese policy and relations with the Middle East, the latest developments in Hong Kong, and the U.S.-China trade war. We will be discussing these issues with our guests, Michael Sobolik, fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, and Jonathon Fulton, assistant professor at the Zayed University. Thank you so much. Jonathon joining us from Abu Dhabi and Michael here with us in the studio. I do want to focus this episode on China. We want to know a little bit more from you about what's happening inside of China. We know also there's the Hong Kong situation. People are wondering about the reasons why we're seeing this happening today. Is it related to the American economical war on China? If you can put it in a nutshell to us, how would you describe the situation today?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing in Hong Kong today is the product of a failed policy from the Communist Party of China. For many years, starting in 1997, the party has attempted to have a one country, two systems approach to this city. And the deal has been that Hong Kong can have a separate political apparatus, separate economic apparatus, and in exchange, they're still part of China. So what we're seeing now is what may be the disintegration of this grand deal that was struck between the party and the people of Hong Kong several years ago. And it's unclear as to how this is going to play out, but you mentioned the trade war as well. There's a lot happening with China right now these days, and the trade war between the United States and China is related in that we're seeing the fraying of a lot of assumptions that used to govern this relationship for a long time, starting with President Nixon going into even the Reagan administration and certainly the Clinton administration. There was this assumption that if we traded with China, they would become like us, meaning that they would democratize and change politically. That has not happened, and we have, in a sense, by trading with China, created a security issue for the United States globally and certainly in Asia. So the question is, how do we adjust or recalibrate our policy? The trade war is certainly a part of that. Hong Kong relates to it because the question that we will likely face as Americans is the same question that we faced after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, which is, how do we respond to this? Now, it's certainly unclear how the party will react to what's happening in Hong Kong. Maybe it won't pan out the same way it did in Tiananmen Square, but the trajectory raises a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. How would you comment on that, Jonathon?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think one of the things that Hong Kong signals to me is just China, especially from the vantage point of people watching overseas. China's often portrayed as an inevitable juggernaut. And a lot of the analysis misses out on the important domestic politics. I mean, they have domestic politics too. And there's a lot of pressures domestically in terms of the economy, in terms of the direction the CCP is taking the country in. And Hong Kong, to me, is just a very interesting reflection of that. That there is a pushback, that the people in Hong Kong know as well as anybody, if not better than anybody, what they're up against and what would happen if their city becomes fully integrated politically with China, and that they're pushing back as fiercely and as strongly as they are, I think is an indication of just a reluctance to be absorbed into becoming a more normal Chinese city. And it didn't really get commented on a lot, but when this started in Hong Kong, there were also some protests happening within different Chinese cities as well. And it just looked like perhaps there could be a spillover effect, which is why I think the Chinese government has had to respond the way it has, really.
Mm-hmm. Would you comment on that, just because how has the Chinese has been, in your opinion, given that this is, it's not a democratic country. I mean, and Hong Kong has been part of, more independent. They were part of Britain for a while. So, I mean, it's a very tough situation, knowing that the Chinese system is just not prepared to deal with this type of, people demonstrating in the streets, asking for their rights. It's a tough situation.
The response...
But they've been dealing with a lot of them.
Go ahead, Jonathon,
Sorry,
and then we'll get back to you, Michael.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that they've got a lot of experience with this. The number of, they call mass incidents in China has been pretty substantial over the past few decades. whether or not it's a democracy, I think is irrelevant. They still have to deal with the same type of pressures. The Chinese government system is based on performance legitimacy, whereas they don't have to run in elections. But the whole deal is we have to continue to perform at a certain level, mostly economically, and provide public goods in a way to prove that we deserve to continue governing. And that's a tremendous pressure that they feel. And that this protest in Hong Kong could have a spillover effect, I think is quite scary for a lot of leaders in Beijing. When you ask how they're responding, I mean, they can't directly intervene because, as Michael brought up, the specter of Tiananmen is always going to hang over everything they do. So I think they've been as measured as they possibly can be about this. I mean, it's a no-win for everybody, but I certainly think behind the scenes there's a lot of concern that what's the exit strategy for this? It's really not certain yet to me.
Michael, what's your comment on that? Because this is, like I said, it's a dilemma for this type of government that has been ruling China for so long to face this, massive protests.
It truly is, and to compound all of the dynamics that Jonathon brought up, October 1st, which is not that long away from here, is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. This will be a matter of national celebration for the party. Under normal circumstances, it would be. We're also 30 years away from 2049, which General Secretary Xi Jinping has identified as the emergence of China and the emergence of the China dream, the establishment of China as a world power again. So this is, in a way, a big problem for the party, that this incident with Hong Kong is happening now. It is a no-win situation for Xi Jinping, for anyone inside of the party apparatus. If they continue to wait this out, which is effectively what they have been doing thus far, with a few gray zone tactics here and there, if they continue to wait this out and the protests still are going on October 1st, it's a national and frankly an international embarrassment for the party. If they intervene a la Tiananmen style, the condemnation is going to be universal. We don't know what the response will be, but it will at least be incredibly embarrassing. So there are no good options for Xi Jinping here, which means that he's frankly in a corner, which is a dangerous place for a dictatorship to be when they're scared of their own people. Rarely do good things happen under those circumstances.
So that's, especially when we're talking about that being in the exact same time when this administration is being very aggressive, as it's been described, in countering China economically. China has been trying to always evade international norms and agreements on, trades, and this administration has finally said, enough, we're going to do something about it. But how could that complicate the situation for China and for Hong Kong, given that this is now, it's a lot of pressure being mounted internationally from the United States and, like you said, inside of China?
It's really difficult for them because Xi Jinping has pressure from without and from within now, which means that, when was it? Not that long ago, when he wrote his own political ideology into the Communist Party constitution and completely did away with term limits for himself. So not that long ago, he was in a very secure position, but now things are looking very differently for him. He has to contend on multiple fronts, not just for his own political survival, but he needs to prove to his communist cadres that he is the man to lead China right now. And Jonathon mentioned the social compact between the party and the people inside of China, that if they deliver economic results, then presumably the people of China will be able to put up with a lot. And that has held true for a long time. But the spillover threat that Jonathon mentioned is quite real. And it's not just a popular spillover. Xi Jinping has to consider how strong is his hold within the elite structure when he's getting hit from the Trump administration on trade and internally with Hong Kong with these protests.
What do you comment on this, Jonathon? As we mentioned, the trade war is big, is massive. We're seeing the ripple effect on Chinese companies throughout the world. How do you describe this type of pressure that is being put on China all at once?
Well, in terms of the trade war, I think actually it's a bit of a lucky break for China, actually, that it's happening right now, because traditionally in a situation like this, we would expect to see a strong statement of support or condemnation or something from an American presidential administration. And that it's happening at the same time the trade war is taking place. It seems that these things, it adds a further complication that nobody really wants to touch too clearly. We saw these Hong Kong people out on the streets, and they were, I believe, singing the Star Spangled Banner recently. They've been making overtures towards America, and they're not really getting the response I think they might have expected. Certainly that they got during the Tiananmen, when they had their own Statue of Liberty. So I think that it's actually been a kind of a lucky break for China, just that under this administration, there hasn't been a coupling of these type of demands that you'd normally have, and it kind of maybe reduces the pressure that he otherwise might have from a peer competitor like the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Jonathon, I want to ask you with another follow-up question, because, like as you said, it's to the administration. This is, we've done so much so far. We don't want to be, pressuring China further at this point. And I think that was like an almost more of an international, agreement so far, that nobody's talking as much about the Hong Kong situation as they would have probably done without having this trade war. But in terms of inside of the United States, is there a consensus, in your opinion, on this very kind of aggressive position towards China? Is that something that Democrats also agree on with Republicans? Or is there also, this is another foreign policy issue where we see that both parties have each a completely different position on issues from the other?
Okay, well, a couple of disclaimers first. I live in Abu Dhabi, so the narrative that's happening in the U.S., I'm getting second or third hand. And I'm also not from the States, I'm Canadian, so I'm not really maybe the guy to ask about this. But I have been in Washington recently, and one thing I noticed was that it's pretty easy to get political capital by bashing China right now, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It seems that this is a pretty safe play for anybody to make, to be tough on China. I think that, like Michael was mentioning earlier, there have been certain expectations that Chinese behavior might get more in line with an American liberal democratic system the more that they engaged with countries like the West or like the U.S., and that hasn't happened. So I think there's some disappointment from both sides of the aisle in the U.S., and I think that probably contributes to maybe a sense within the U.S. political system that pushing on China isn't the worst thing right now, applying a little pressure and trying to get a different result. Whether or not that is the case, I guess remains to be seen, but it's a pretty interesting, as a political scientist, it's a pretty interesting phenomenon to watch right now.
Mm-hmm. What do you comment, Michael, on this? Is that something that at least there's a consensus on within the U.S. government?
In some areas, yes. In others, it's still disputed. So I spent some time on Capitol Hill until recently, and I'll tell you what I saw there in a lot of the China debates. There are three areas that the United States and the city in general is in the process of reevaluating right now. The first is insulating American society and entities from Chinese non-traditional collections, influence operations, espionage. The second is deconflicting what in often cases is legitimate commerce with China and making sure that it's not going towards unintended end uses such as gross human rights violations inside of China. You see this with the tech sector a lot, particularly in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. Mm-hmm. The third element that we have going on here is geopolitical competition. This gets to the Belt and Road aspect of Chinese grand strategy, how to counter it. It gets to what they're doing in the South China Sea with island reclamation. Across the board, you'll see different responses for how Washington is engaging. When it comes to insulating our society, there's broad bipartisan agreement here. You see Congress working together on the issue of Confucius Institutes in particular. Mm-hmm. When it comes to trade and commerce, This is far trickier. I mean, we've talked about trade a lot. You also have export controls as well. And this is where the long-standing business interests in the United States who have a vested desire to have legitimate commerce with China, this is potentially the trickiest part of the relationship. And frankly, there is no consensus either within the parties or between the parties on how to resolve that yet. It's going to be very complicated. When it comes to geopolitical competition, that's emerging as well, but Republicans and Democrats generally supported the administration's decision to remove the Chinese military from Rim of the Pacific naval exercises in Hawaii last year. That was not a controversial decision at all. So across the board, it's tricky, and I think one of the reasons it's difficult is because for so long we had a very similar assumption to China that China actually has internally as well. Like we were just discussing how the grand deal between the party and the people is if we provide you money, you won't rebel against us. We told ourselves for many years that if we traded with China, if we gave them money in effect, that they would become like us. And that has proven to be absolutely not true. So we are not just trying to figure out what do we do differently, we're trying to think differently as well. And that's going to take many years to figure out.
I mean, another aspect to China is the whole persecution against different religions, including now the Uyghurs. We know that what the Chinese government has been doing to them. I want to hear your opinion, Jonathan, on this issue. I mean, why aren't we hearing enough criticism from the international community in general about this specific issue? I mean, what type of action could be done specifically for this type of targeting to an entire minority? And it's we're talking about millions of people inside of China.
Well, I think one reason is that we don't exactly know what is happening because it's really a very tough environment for journalists, independent journalists to operate in. So we have an idea, and what we think we know is pretty awful. And I think what we have seen, I mean, the New York Times had a very big story on this a few months ago. A lot of the news has been broke from, I believe, Reuters and the New York Times and some folks in Germany, I believe. So there has been some discussion about it. I don't think there's been enough, but one thing we're seeing is maybe two things at play. One is that a lot of states feel they've seen that Chinese economic statecraft can have a very coercive element. There were cases, for example, when Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe in 2010, and then Norway became, lost a lot of trade with China. When South Korea brought the THAAD missile system onto the peninsula, China targeted a lot of South Korean business, and tourism to Korea dropped a lot. The rare earths from Japan was something that was blocked with the island dispute with Japan in 2010. I think a lot of states realize that they're really heavily leveraged with China and don't really want to go out on a limb and start poking it for something that China consistently says is its own domestic affairs. The flag of sovereignty kind of works in their favor in this case. I think that's one element. I think another element, and this isn't one I necessarily agree with, but it's something I see a lot of, is that the Chinese government has been pretty consistent in framing this as a response to what they see as a very difficult, challenging political ideology that challenges the Communist Party's rule. And a lot of states that you would expect to see supporting the Uyghurs as Muslims or as a human rights issue also feel that they have some issues with political Islamic ideology, which also threatens regimes in a lot of places. So that China has framed it in this way has really resonated with some states that you might expect to see pushing China on this issue. So I think it's really those two things. It's just the economic leverage combined with other places having their own difficult situation or difficult relationship with competing ideological groups within their own countries.
I mean, but assuming that all of the people who are Muslim are ideologically, could be extremists is also another big question here is that, everybody is being subjugated to the fear of a few. And I know you said that you don't agree with that, Jonathan. I want to redirect that to Michael. Because, we also heard criticisms from European countries, but we didn't hear a lot of criticism from, for example, Muslim countries. To China, which is really interesting, knowing that this is a Muslim minority that was just systematically being targeted. And I'm talking about Arab and Muslim countries. Why do you think that we're seeing this? And I want to hear it from both of you.
One of the key elements here is that China has the capacity to export something that these Arab and Muslim countries desperately want, which is 21st century smart city technology that allows them to have unparalleled surveillance capacity. When you're a dictatorship, you have a lot of problems that democracies don't have. You have some government benefits that relate to efficiency and stuff like that, but you have to, in a sense, protect yourself from your own people, and China is quite good at doing that. And they have the ability to essentially give you ready-made in a box, cutting-edge technology that no other country can provide, to where you can surveil more than just video surveillance. You have electronic surveillance, and in the age of 5G, where everything is going to be interconnected, this is essential if you are a government that wants to keep ahead of where your own dissidents might be going. This used to be quite easy. Jonathon mentioned Liu Xiaobo, which is one of the best examples of courage standing up to the Communist Party inside of China. He passed away a number of years ago, but things are much more difficult for a dictatorship these days to track internal dissent and organization. No one is better than China. And a lot of these countries in the Middle East are smaller than China, which means it'll be even easier for them once they get the technology. So part of it is indeed having the fear of the hammer blow of clapback from China if they do something the party doesn't like. Part of it, too, is internal issues of terrorism and maybe incorrect ways of framing it. But there's another issue at play, and it's that China has something that they want. And if they speak out against what's happening in Xinjiang, they might not get it.
Okay, so we're talking about 5G technology right now, right?
Yes.
Would you comment on that, Jonathan? This is a very important point, because this is also a part of why the United States is waging the economical wars, because the 5G technology should not be basically taken over by China, because according to experts here in Washington, that means this could be misused in so many ways. It could threaten democratic states around the world. But what's your comment on that?
Well, okay. I think, first of all, I think that if the U.S. doesn't want other countries to adopt Chinese 5G networks, then they should compete better. I was on a flight to Washington a few months ago. It was a 14-hour flight, and I was sitting beside a guy from Chad, and we started talking about this, because here in the Emirates, this is a big issue. Huawei is a very, almost every country in the Middle East is excited to get Huawei. Mm-hmm. And Washington has been leaning on them to say, reconsider it. You don't know what you're getting yourselves into. So I was asking this guy from Chad, and he actually works for a telecom company. What's your take on it? And he said, we would much rather have the American tech. We can't afford it. The Chinese stuff is cheaper. Something Michael referred to just a minute ago is that China will give it to you all right out of the box, no conditions applied. Most Western countries don't do this, whether it's 5G, whether it's weapons sales, whether it's anything. There's a lot of conditionality, so that the price is considered better. Maybe the tech isn't considered as good, but it's good enough for what they want, and it's reliable, and the after service is great, and it's affordable. So I would say, if the U.S. doesn't want other countries to take what China has, then just don't complain about it. Compete, beat them at it.
What is your response to that, Michael?
I think that Jonathon is correct, and it's going to be an essential component of American strategy to compete. If you look at how Secretary Pompeo has approached this issue thus far. In a recent tour he had throughout Europe, some of those stops were at Five Eyes allied countries of the United States, Britain in particular. He made the case from an ideological perspective, but also from a security perspective as to why Huawei is a challenge. That is a good place to start, but alone, it is insufficient because we can talk all day about the threats that Huawei and ZTE, Hikvision, Dahua, and other countries pose to internal security, but if there's no credible economic alternative, it will be nearly impossible for any country to turn down 5G technology, especially if it's as cheap as what Huawei can offer. This is going to be one of the biggest challenges that the United States will face. How do we not just win the discussion of what is right or wrong, but how do we win the technological competition that's happening right now?
And I mean, I had a couple of experts on this topic, and they were talking about, here the bureaucracy and how each state operates differently, and creating this will be much more difficult than an easier kind of put together country like China, where like the ruling party, as long as they're giving you the authority, like, these companies work a little bit more fluently or like easily in that environment. But I don't want to talk about that and focus on this unless you have something to say about this, because this is, a completely different topic, and it's I think it's a very complicated, right?
Yes.
Issue here, because it is what they also said. But in terms of the Middle East, I want to talk about what China is doing now in the Middle East. Obviously, there's an interest there. This is an area that is, it's a center. It's very close to Europe. All these governments are interested in having a relationship with China. But what does that relationship entails? And I want to start with you, Jonathon. You are in UAE. What does this type of relationship means for the countries in the Middle East? I mean, China is the second strongest country in the world.
It depends when we look at the Middle East. I mean, so where I am in the Gulf, on the Arabian Peninsula, this is obviously a very highly developed region with a lot of wealth and a lot of opportunity, and also a set of countries that's trying to diversify their economies with these Saudi Vision 2030 and Abu Dhabi 2030 and New Kuwait 2035. These are economic diversification programs that are essentially built on infrastructure and connectivity and these are things that fit in really nicely with what China's trying to do in the region. So from the Gulf perspective, what China offers, it's become the biggest source of FDI in the Middle East. I think that happened in 2016. They're investing tremendously. They're providing a lot of construction. They do infrastructure really well. And this all comes back to something that really is very important when we talk about what China's doing in the Middle East, is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is something that China rolled out in 2013. It actually predates that by quite a while, because China's been doing this for a long time now. But in 2013, they kind of rolled out this full package of what this Belt and Road looks like. And it's an overland route through Eurasia that ends up in Europe, and it's a sea route that goes across the Indian Ocean region, and also the east coast of Africa and Mediterranean. And the Arabian Peninsula is a hub in that. It connects a lot of important regions. It connects a lot of important markets. So when China looks here, they see a region that's going to be quite important to their strategic goals for quite a while. And when the leaders and the people here look towards China, they see a lot of things we've been talking about today. There's not an ideological component. You've brought up democracy several times so far in our conversation. China will never bring that up. They would say good governance transcends political model. If you can provide good governance as an authoritarian state or as a monarchy or as a dictatorship, that's your business. They find that attractive because a lot of Western countries, again, apply conditions on what they're willing to do here. So China doesn't do this. They have a positive vision of the future for the region. When they talk about inclusion in the Belt and Road, it's saying, hey, we see the Middle East as part of a bigger picture. And that's not something that they hear very often here. When you hear somebody from the UK or Washington or Canada or wherever talk about the Middle East, it's almost always as a problem that needs to be solved. So when they hear China talking about a part of a bigger program, harking back to these kind of glory days of the Silk Road, it's very attractive. So I think there's a lot of synergy or a lot of complementarity that goes both ways. Again, as I said, it depends on which part of the Middle East you're talking about. If you're in a lesser developed place, then you probably see your economy being kind of overwhelmed by cheaper Chinese commercial goods or things like this. But again, when loans or when assistance comes in, or infrastructure development or investment, there's not a lot of other countries that are willing to come in on the same scale. So I think they're willing to embrace China in this way. And the other part, and I'll finish with this, is just that it provides a diversification of its great power relations. Obviously, the U.S. has been a very important actor in the Middle East for quite a while now. Mm-hmm. A series of political decisions or a series of political signaling over the past, really since 2003, has made everybody rethink that and think, well, maybe we have to look elsewhere. So you see Russia playing a bigger role, you see India playing a bigger role, Japan and Korea are getting more actively involved. And I think nobody offers the totality of what China does. I don't think China competes on the same level as the U.S., but I think it just offers a more diversified set of options. So I think that's kind of what they look at when they see China coming over here.
Mm-hmm. What is your comment on that, Michael? This is very important because we're seeing this happening systematically, and it's been happening for a while, but what does that mean for the region and for the world, this type of infiltration that we see China is trying to create, and this type of relationships and maybe dependency on China that might occur in the region?
So something that Jonathon said that is so key is the difference between how the United States and China approach the Middle East region. Jonathon's characterization of how the United States typically views a lot of the issues in the Middle East as a problem to be solved, whereas China views it as potentially shared interests to work together towards a common goal. If you recast how the Communist Party views the region, this is not explicit in how they talk about their strategy, their relations, or their engagements. But China, in the medium and long term, views the Middle East as a part of its growing sphere of influence, which is entirely differently from how the United States views it. It is a critical region that matters a lot to the United States. Energy security, grand strategy, human rights agenda, absolutely, and key alliances there as well. But it's not the same as a sphere of influence for the United States. It's on the same landmass as China. The Belt and Road Initiative, which Jonathon touched on, is critical to understanding why China views it as part of their sphere of influence. They need the Middle East because right now they're entirely dependent on the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea for their energy exports and their imports. This is a deal breaker for Chinese strategy in the 21st century. If they're going to succeed, they need land routes to the Middle East for oil. They absolutely need it. So all of the investment that we are seeing China put into the region, part of it is tech, undoubtedly, but a huge part of this is energy security.
What about, I mean, we talk about the growing influences in the region, given that the United States, as you mentioned, is trying to pull out and not pull in or go in, which is what we're seeing from Russia, for example. Russia has been going into the region, and now you were talking about the Chinese interest as well. Are we talking about a competition between Russia and China in the Middle East, or is it more of a collaboration? It could be a place where both of them can operate in a good way, type of scenario.
The future of Russian-Sino relations in the Middle East is going to be figured out over time for the main reason that these two countries, from the American perspective, have a lot of common interests, but historically they have no affection for one another. This goes to the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War when you had the Soviets and Mao Zedong actually nearly come to blows on their border in a way that could have had big implications for nuclear escalation. So, and even if you go past that, there's no love lost between Russia and China. But currently, there are a lot of shared interests, and the Middle East is quite potentially one of them. So, as the United States looks to marginally and increasingly disengage from a lot of the conflicts that they've been engaged in, this is going to be potentially an opportunity for Russia, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who have a lot of common interests when it comes to making sure the United States does not have the preponderance of influence and power on the Eurasian landmass that they have for quite some time.
What do you think, Jonathan? Because that's a very important aspect of this changing situation in the Middle East and the influence that we're seeing. Western pullout, Chinese and Russian pulling in or coming in.
Sure. Well, the first thing I would take issue with is the U.S. pullout, because I don't think any of the stats on the ground would support that. I mean, you see with the president talking a lot about pulling out of Syria, pulling out of Afghanistan, the Middle East Strategic Alliance, where they would, Middle Eastern countries would be more involved in their own security. But the reality is, the U.S. has a tremendous security architecture in place, and it doesn't move that easily. It's kind of bolted down, and we haven't seen troop numbers dropping. We haven't seen arms sales dropping. I really think that this is a kind of a false narrative that we're seeing the U.S. trying to pull out. I think the U.S. would like to have a less deep footprint, but none of its actions politically are really reinforcing that. As to Russia and China coming in, I think there's a difference here. Russia doesn't really have, to my thinking, either a positive strategy for the Middle East. I don't think it sees that the Middle East as really being a core interest. I think what Russia looks at when they see the Middle East, first of all, is I think that when they looked at Syria, there's of course the ports, and access to the Mediterranean, which is important. But I think their bigger concern was political Islam blowback into Russia, through their southern Caucasus area. I think they saw that as a bigger issue, where a lot of these people were going to come back from the fight against the Syrian government and come into Russia and wreak havoc at home. So I think that's what drove a lot of what they were doing in the Middle East and in the Syrian theater, at least. And I think when they look at the Gulf, it's really just a matter of trying to engage so they might have some influence in energy markets. But otherwise, I don't think that they're really seen as an honest broker in the Middle East, and I don't think they really have a lot of really core strategic interests here. Whereas China, I think, kind of like what I was getting at earlier, they actually have a pretty deep and important idea of what they want to achieve here. Both Michael and I have talked about this. The Belt and Road was written into China's constitution in 2017. It's completely linked to the Communist Party's legitimacy. It's completely linked to Xi Jinping's rule or leadership. They can't afford for it to fail. It's too big to fail. And a big part of it is passing through the Middle East successfully, which requires a stable Middle East, which means China's going to have to see this through whatever model, whether it's security as development or governance. I think it's just too important for them to really rely on, say, the U.S. to cover it for them. So I think what China's doing is they're coming in here, getting more actively involved economically and politically. They're building a physical presence. And this is interesting because this infrastructure that they're building, these ports here in Abu Dhabi or in Duqm in Oman, or this base in Djibouti, a lot of this stuff could be seen as a public good. They're building this port in this village, essentially in Oman, Duqm. The Indian Navy is going to be able to use this. The U.S. Navy is going to be able to use this. It's not really just a Chinese development. This is something that other states are going to be able to access as well. So I think that China's coming in here with a much more broader view of what they want to achieve here, and I think everybody's really quite receptive to it. So I guess I wouldn't see it as an infiltration the way you described. I think when I talk to Arab people in the region, that they're really excited about the chance that this might offer something to them developmentally or politically or security-wise.
Mm-hmm. You wrote, Jonathan, that China is basically changing the rules of the situation in the Middle East, and it's not only economical. How else is China trying to basically come in to the region?
Well, I mean, that's it. They've got a bit of a dilemma, because if they try to come in with a security presence, first of all, you would have to be crazy, because it's a very fraught environment and you're going to get into trouble. But also, just thinking from the perspective of where I am in the Gulf, when China looks at the Gulf, they see a place that's kind of fit in quite nicely under this U.S. security umbrella. They get into the Gulf cost-free, essentially. They don't have to worry about security. They don't have to worry about the shipping lanes. They know that the U.S. Navy is going to protect all of this stuff. So they're able to come in quite easily and focus on economic mostly and political cooperation. They do it differently. They're working with everybody. They're working with Iran, Iraq, all the GCC countries, Israel, Palestine, Qatar, the Emirates. They're not kind of bound to the same game that the U.S. has, or I shouldn't say game, that's a little flippant, but they're not bound to the same type of commitments that the U.S. is because they don't have the same type of history here. So they can plausibly, well, they can, as they did, go to Riyadh in January 2016 and sign a comprehensive strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia, and then the very next day fly to Tehran and sign the exact same deal with the Iranians. And everybody looks at it and says, how can you do this? I mean, you have to choose one side or the other, get off the fence. And the Chinese can just say, look, there is no fence. That's Washington's fence. We don't have those same parameters that we're dealing with. We can afford to work with everybody because we aren't coming in and trying to change a security environment. So it does represent a very different approach, and I think it's one that a lot of other extra-regional powers also see. I mean, if you look at Japan and Korea, they get a lot of energy from Iran. They would like to be investing in Iran as well. The same deal with India, which is investing tremendously in this Chabahar port. A lot of countries would like to see a more inclusive security architecture here in the Gulf and see it as maybe something positive to build on. So I think, you know, when we say it's changing the rules, I think they're just playing a different game. I don't think they're changing the rules. I think they're just playing a totally different game from what the U.S. has done.
What would you comment on that, Michael? Because, you know, we are seeing that this is, you know, they come in, they don't have their own positions on political issues, but rather we're just interested in creating economical and trade relationships with everybody.
So this is absolutely part of the quote-unquote win-win diplomacy that the Chinese have been purporting to have for about a decade now. The underlying belief being that both sides can gain from deeper engagement with China. Jonathon touched on the way that the maybe different rules or different game that the Chinese are bringing into the region. One of the ways that this will inevitably lead into a military presence in the region on the part of the Chinese militaries, because historically, economic interests always precede military interests. If you look at even how the United States history has flowed, the United States grew economically, expanded, and to have global economic relations, and to secure those relations, you need to protect not just economic interests, but you need to protect Americans abroad. And this is a huge reason why you see the Chinese set up a military base in Djibouti, not only for strategic reasons, but the practical reason that a lot of these workers throughout the Middle East fulfilling these Belt and Road contracts are Chinese citizens. This is another part of the package when you go into the Belt and Road deal. You will have the project constructed not by your own workers, not by your own citizens, but by Chinese citizens. And
we've been seeing this in Africa, as you mentioned, Djibouti, in other countries.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. So Djibouti is a leading indicator of how the entire region is going to go. It will not be the last military base that the Chinese have. And frankly, a lot of these ports that they've been able to secure limited leases on will trend in the direction of dual use. It might be under the radar. It might not be explicitly People's Liberation Army ships docking there. But if we've seen anything in the South China Sea, it is not difficult for China or Russia, for that matter, to engage in gray zone tactics and to secure your military and security interests, even if you don't use the official military arm. So this is a trend that likely won't come to immediate fruition. It's going to take time to develop, but the more China secures its economic interests, the more it develops its interests economically, they will have to find a way to secure it.
Tell us a little bit more about Africa. I mean, I do want to touch on Africa a little bit more, Michael, because when we talk about the China model, I mean, the Chinese people are not living the best life, out there. So talking about this type of influence and what could it entail for the people of the Middle East eventually is a really scary thing.
Yes.
Tell me what's happening in Africa that we need to pay attention to, because to just see what could happen in the region, eventually.
China is the only great power on the planet that is paying strategic attention to Africa. And it's a loss for the United States, and it's a loss for a lot of other countries, because the Communist Party basically saw an opportunity. It's the same concept as when you buy a stock: buy low and you sell high. It is easy to get into Africa from an aid perspective. It's low cost to enter that economic market because, frankly, there just aren't a lot of other players there. The United States has our foreign aid, which is expanded throughout Africa, but as we've talked about, those rules are quite different from how China engages with their economic development whenever they go into a country or a region. So we see infrastructure projects all throughout Africa that China will negotiate with a government. And because of the lack of institutional establishment throughout the continent, many of these deals are quite corrupt. There's a lot of kickbacks to the elites. Some of these projects have either not been completed, they're grossly overdue, or they're poor quality, sometimes all three. But what happens is when you sign the Belt and Road contract, generally you will find in the not too distant future that the interest rates begin to increase. And a lot of these countries in Africa and in South Asia, for that matter, find themselves in positions where they are unable to keep up with the payment for these projects. The buzzword predatory debt diplomacy, and there's a vibrant debate as to whether or not China is intending to entrap countries or whether it's a byproduct of how they've gone about doing it. That debate aside for a moment, the impact, which no one can dispute, is that Chinese influence relative to American influence is increasing in a precipitous way inside of Africa. And one final example, the African Union headquarters. China provided all the services to wire this building, which is Africa's analog to the United Nations. It was discovered that Huawei has wired the building and was sending signals of correspondence regularly back to China over all of the discussions that were had inside of that building. So
they're spying on that building as they're wiring it, as if it's a service that they're giving.
Yeah, precisely. Like we'll develop for you, then we'll spy on you with the technology that we gave you. Yeah.
Given the type of government that we know exists in China, what do you make, Jonathon, of this? This is a very concerning aspect of the Chinese interests in the region. I mean, what would that mean for the people eventually to be getting that same kind of influence and then the same type of basically final product that we see in China and the Chinese people live under? That's not a very attractive model, is it?
Well, I'll play devil's advocate, I guess. It wasn't so long ago that we found out that the U.S. was spying on a lot of its allies too, right? Everybody plays this game. Everybody plays it. China's built almost every parliament in Africa.
I would not compare the United States to China, though, in terms of how it treats its own citizens, not to mention other countries and its allies.
Sure, I know you wouldn't, but I think other people might. I'm not certainly.
Based on what?
I realize there's a big gap. Well, I realize there is a big gap between. I mean, I consider myself pretty lucky to be born in Canada and not have been born in Beijing. I think I hit the jackpot there, for sure. But I think a lot of other places will look at what China's been able to do in the past 30, 40 years and think, hey, you know what? Democracy doesn't provide that for us. We've had elections and we've got terrible corruption. It doesn't work. I think when we come back to things like this debt trap diplomacy and a lot of the cautions people have about this, that's really, to me, the bigger issue. You look at some countries that have failed miserably or have this overwhelming debt burden to Chinese companies. That's almost always a consequence of a couple of things. Not necessarily predatory practices by China, although that could be a part of it. A bigger issue is just corruption on the ground. So you see some states like, this port in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Does anybody really think that that was the whole point of the Belt and Road, is just to finagle a port that doesn't really do anything in Sri Lanka? I mean, I think it's more of a burden for China than anything to have to take this thing on. I think during the Belt and Road Forum in March, they did realize that they have a terrible image problem because for the first maybe 4 or 5 years, nobody really talked about the Belt and Road. It kind of flew under the radar. And then when things like the story of Hambantota came out, or the electioneering in Pakistan, or in the Maldives, or in Malaysia, opposition parties would say, hey, we're stuck in these deals that our current government signed with China, and it makes us beholden to China. It gives China too big a role in our economy. When I come into power, if you vote for me, we'll change the terms. And they come into power, and they almost always do the exact same thing. Malaysia did the same thing. The Maldives did the same thing, and Imran Khan in Pakistan is as well. Mm-hmm. So I think they realize they're I wouldn't say stuck with it, but they're going to continue using it because they see it as the best option they have. And again, I think if you don't want this debt trap business, then don't be a corrupt government. States have agency. Some states have more, some use it better. Here we can see very wealthy states in the Gulf that are able to set more attractive terms when they're doing business on these things. Maybe Djibouti feels they don't have that, although I think Djibouti does have quite a bit of leverage with all the states that have ports there. Sri Lanka, I think, could have gotten more out of China if they wanted. I just don't think I think their elites let them down. Mm-hmm. I think that's a bigger story, is just, corrupt elites not using the agency or the leverage that they have at their disposal to get something better out of China than they otherwise did.
I do want to ask you a follow-up and the last question for tonight's episode, because we're out of time, Jonathon, and I wanted to comment on it, Michael, as well. It's do those countries in the region, in the Middle East, eventually would have to choose between working with the West and the United States specifically, and working with China as this economical war goes on? And if they do, what will happen? I do want to ask both of you, because this is going to definitely play a role eventually as this war continues, and we're seeing the effects and the ripple effects of it now, actually.
I was at a dinner talking about this last night with some Emirati and other Arab people, and this subject came up, and they all seem pretty comfortable with the idea that they can have more than one partner at once. They don't expect China to pick sides. Again, agency. When the UAE says you want to have a partnership with Qatar and you want to have one with us as well, we have to use whatever we can to make ourselves more attractive in your eyes. So you work more closely, with us than with the state that we don't necessarily like. And the same goes with Iran and Saudi and whoever else. I think, so from that perspective, I don't think that local actors, I don't think local states really see it as an either-or situation. At the same time, we've seen a lot of pressure coming out of D.C. Secretary Pompeo and former National Security Advisor Fulton had both, I wouldn't say caution, I think that kind of threatened the Israeli government to say, if you're going to have this Chinese-managed port at Haifa, then maybe the U.S. Navy can't go there anymore because you're using Chinese tech that might burrow its way into our systems. The same thing with this Russian missile defense system that the Turkish just bought. And then the U.S. says, well, no F-35s for you because we can't, and it could be a very legitimate security concern for the U.S. But what we're seeing isn't China saying pick a side, or the Arab states or Middle Eastern states saying China pick a side. I think the U.S. is definitely looking at this as a threat, and kind of leaning pretty heavily on its partners or its regional allies to say, you can't have the same depth of cooperation with us if your bases are going to have, Huawei 5G networks, or if the Chinese Navy is going to have listening posts in your ports, or all these things. So I think when we say it's going to be one side or the other, I think that question really relates to how does Washington perceive it more than how do Middle Eastern countries see it.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in terms of the sanctions itself, the new sanctions, I mean, that's going to affect its potential partners, China's potential partners in the region, especially if the United States is going to keep increasing these sanctions going forward. Michael?
Yes. The United States is eagerly trying to get its allies and partners to see China the way that they see China. And I think that there's a unspoken belief that from America's perspective, this should be easier than it is. I think there's some frustration in Washington right now that a lot of these conversations, whether in the Middle East, throughout Asia or elsewhere, that there isn't as much overlap as maybe folks in Washington would hope. A lot of people mistakenly view the U.S.-China relationship as a jet ski that's easy to drive fast and change direction quickly at the same time. It's much more like a barge. This is a massive thing that moves through the ocean at a slow rate, but it's very heavy and it's difficult to change direction. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort to change, especially with this monumental shift that the administration is trying to undertake right now. So that's a long way of saying I don't think anyone has any idea what the future of the United States relations in the Middle East vis-a-vis China will look like. There's so much to figure out. And if anything, policymakers all around the world need to buckle up for a long period of reevaluation. This is going to take many years to figure out.
I mean, I think I'll end it here. I thank you so much both. That was a great discussion. Thank you, Jonathon, for joining us from Abu Dhabi, UAE, and would love to have you again in the future. And thank you so much, Michael, for joining us from the studio in Washington.
Thank you.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.